Welcome everybody to the latest edition of Collectively Speaking. This is a podcast series where I get to sit down with different members of the LDN Collective and ask them more about what they do and how they got into it in the first place. And really we're talking about the big issues in the built environment. And the great thing about the collective is we have lots of people with different specialisms, but when we come together as a group, we like to be able to look at things more broadly and holistically. Really grateful to DAR Group for being in their offices, and I'm going to be speaking to Andy Stanton, who is of Introba, who are our experts in sustainability. Sustainability and mechanical electrical engineering has always been something that's been quite niche and specialist input at the table, but it's increasingly now at the forefront of really driving everything that we do. And the only way we can achieve our net zero ambitions as a country and do that quickly, whether it's new buildings or existing buildings. So I'm really interested to hear from Andy about that and where things are going in the future. Andy, I know that you have had a really interesting journey in your professional life in terms of having previously worked at Transport for London, or Places for London as it's now called, and now obviously working in the private sector with Introba. Tell us a bit more about your background, how you got here and what you're up to at the moment, and about Introba and what you do.
Sure. Hi Max, thanks for asking me to come on. So my background, I had various starts in life and career choice, but a very early influence was my mum worked in conferences as a conference interpreter and brought me back some material from an energy conference in Ireland when I was probably 16 on energy efficiency and renewables, and it really kind of hit a chord with me, struck a chord. So from that point though, I did some studies. I actually quit university early on and became an electrician. Trained as an electrician, I ran my own business, was supported by the Prince's Trust to get going, but I always wanted to work in energy efficiency and I couldn't see it going in that direction, so I sold that after about 5 years and went off to study energy, mechanical engineering, energy and environment at university. And came back and it was really difficult to find opportunities, but I actually went into local authority, went into a job there in energy efficiency, working for London Borough of Ealing, who were doing some great stuff then in energy performance contracting, renewing systems and making their schools and sports centres and public buildings more efficient. From there, I went on to Transport for London, and as you said, was actually London Underground at the time and went through various changes and a really exciting time, starting as environment manager, essentially an energy manager role, but wider remit, looking at water and waste efficiency and getting into some really interesting stuff. I spent 18 and a half years at TfL in the end, but whether it was looking at buildings and making them more efficient, looking at water usage, or even across procurement for some really interesting stuff like from first aid supplies to data centres, and the breadth of topics covered was incredible, but give a real grounding experience, very rigorous in how to run business cases, so both from a financial perspective and energy saving, and we did some great stuff, the high point being a building in Southwark, the Palestra building, where we put in a fuel cell in 2009, as well as retrofitting. Well, it was a new building, or very new building, but retrofitting it to a very high standard. So I was head of sustainable buildings and doing some interesting stuff there, and decided as I approached a point in my life and career, why not tear up a job safe life and try consulting. So it started with me doing a Passivhaus Designer course, which was really a kind of an important point, a point in time. It kind of brought all the stuff I'd done previously in my career together, of how to actually do integrated design in a way that brought everyone together in the project. And then spent a couple of years working with a large consultancy, and then quit that during COVID, and decided to do a passive house project on my own house, which was really interesting and really tough through COVID and Brexit challenges, and then came back into working for a very small consultancy, and then joined Introba 6 months ago as head of sustainability. And it's been great. I was really attracted to Introba, formerly Elementa, that had built up a really great name through the LETI, Low Energy Transformation Initiative, that had really kind of made our name and was a great investment in collaborative work, bringing together people across the industry. And the opportunity to be part of that was really exciting. And that's where I am now.
Wow, that's incredible story and journey you've been on, Andy. And I think it's not possible to trust anyone as much as if they've already owned their own electrician practice and designed their own passive house. You must definitely know what you're doing, having done it all, for yourself and on your own. I think that's a great education in itself. But what I'm also quite interested in is where you've got sort of a large-scale landowner like Transport for London, which I think is the biggest landowner in London, I think was told recently.
It's probably up there, yeah.
Yeah, and but also some of the biggest challenges around complexity in the built environment, whether you're working near a live underground station or working within a very tight sort of financial constraints, which obviously an organisation like that is. How are you seeing that sort of translating into practice as a consultant working on, on the private sector, for example, where people are always looking for efficiencies, whether it's to do with cost efficiencies as one of the big sort of factors in any sort of decision making. But equally, regardless of whether the government changes its mind about net zero, most people understand that there is a desperate need to do something positive in order to stop the progress of climate change. So what is it that you think in particular is Introba doing to help take clients on that journey of understanding the cost benefits of more energy efficient buildings?
So I think Introba, and formerly Elementa and Integral, as we were known outside of the UK, our ethos was deep green engineering and really doing things in a sort of different way and making that sustainability at the heart of what we do, whether it's sustainability-driven programs or our engineering services that we provide to developers and clients. I think what I've seen over the time is that occasionally you have to pivot and tell the story in a slightly different way, and sometimes it is focused on the environmental impact, and sometimes, as we've seen last year, cost impact is the main driver. But what we've seen recently is a ramping up of legislation. Whether it's fast enough is up for debate, I guess, but that's really forcing developers large and small to address what they do. So we do that through hopefully being really good at what we do and providing sound advice. And I think that's the key, is providing solutions, pragmatic solutions, but solutions that help clients navigate their way through what is without a doubt a complex legislative arena, but also finding ways that can benefit and work in both ways. So although that can't work all the time, to have your cake and eat it, to find something that meets the legislative requirements, helps clients meet their corporate objectives and gives them a better product that's efficient at the end as well.
So Andy, I mean, I've been working in the built environment for almost 20 years now, and one thing I've noticed is that people who are specialists in things like mechanical, electrical engineering are no longer being brought in sort of further down the line. They're actually being brought in much earlier on in the process, particularly by sort of more enlightened clients. And is that a trend that you see happening in your own experience? And how is that manifesting itself in projects in your day-to-day sort of working life?
Coming into projects relatively late is still a big challenge for us. And we're really excited to get playing with stuff early in the process so we can have a positive impact. But if we're brought in late when things like building form has already been decided, glazing, etc., but we're seeing changes in parametric modelling, and something we're developing with really clever people to look at solutions, to give solutions to developers, to architects, to cost consultants, to look at how we might design things from a really early stage that gives them more freedom to design and gives us the ability to change that design and optimise it. And the earlier we can introduce that building physics to the process in clever ways and communicate it well, the better. And I heard someone recently say, who's done a great piece of work, a lot of work on passive house buildings, and saying that actually what they were excited about in the last 10 years is seeing building physics help make beautiful buildings. And I think that's a great byword of how we can get into projects earlier and really influence them and change them for the better.
That's interesting, Andy. And so the types of projects that you're working on at the moment, are you finding that you're doing a lot more in the way of retrofit of existing buildings? That's one sort of question. But also, I gather there's more issues and complexity around dealing with residential properties and making them more efficient than perhaps larger office-type buildings. Is that something you're finding is the case and it is changing, or how does that tend to play out?
So I think first answering the retrofit question, one of the things I was really lucky to do right at the start of my career journey with London Borough of Ealing, then at TfL, I worked on a really large-scale retrofit program with guaranteed savings and smaller projects as well, to now seeing it becoming much more of a thing. And obviously it has to be. The buildings, I think it used to be quoted that 80% of the buildings that will be there in 2050 already there, so that the opportunity to change new buildings has an effect, but it's not going to do everything. And we're seeing with stories in the news, whether that's the M&S building in Oxford Street or activities or initiatives from the City of London Corporation to focus on retrofit, a much bigger emphasis. I guess that what's great now is that because now we talk in this currency of embodied carbon and whole life carbon, those decisions that sometime maybe previously wouldn't have been taken looking at all the facts are being looked at a bit more carefully. So scrutinised to, is it actually good to do a massive retrofit on a building that's only been there for 10 years? And whereas a building life cycle should maybe be 60 years, but actually maybe individual components are requiring it to be upgraded much more frequently.
Interesting. And I suppose there's also the need for buildings to be more flexible and adaptable, because obviously if 80% is already here, but people are going to the office less, but we have a housing crisis, then this need to look at converting, whether it's sort of aging office stock or other types of retail outlets or what have you, into homes and housing, which I think other countries seem to be doing a lot more effectively. What is it that's necessarily holding us back, and how are you finding it in terms of that type of a project?
So we actually have got a number of projects that are converting office use to residential and different types of residential, which is interesting. A big push on student accommodation and on accommodation that sort of blurs the lines between short stay accommodation and hotels, and how that's kind of driving the market. Whether we need to do more, whether people are moving out of cities, whether those are temporary changes, it's kind of difficult for me to see that. I think one of the big challenges, though, is really bringing in overheating. Overheating in urban environments, well, throughout the UK, is a big challenge that we're trying to design out of buildings. And coming back to the retrofit aspect, going down that retrofit route, which undoubtedly in a lot of situations will have a carbon benefit, are there other standards that we're sort of jettisoning or not focusing on as much as we should because it's a retrofit? So some of the tough standards for new builds, does those not apply to retrofits?
So Andy, one of the projects that we're collaborating on with DAR Group, I know that Introba is one of the brands within DAR Group, is a really exciting project in the Royal Docks, where what we're proposing is to create a whole sort of new destination that has different types of uses, whether that's sort of hospitality, leisure, sports. But the main way of making it financially viable, where the land is very constrained, yet there's a big body of water that is unused, in this case the Royal Victoria Dock and the Royal Albert Dock. What we're proposing to do is having a lot of floating units, and something like 40 of them that can then create the space and the revenue to improve the public realm and make it a destination for local people, but also for Londoners and even people coming to London from elsewhere. So one of the issues, I think, and it's one of the things I'm often challenged on, is with floating development, there's a high cost involved of creating the mechanical and electrical services that are needed to make them viable, either to run a business from or to live in, if it's student accommodation, which we're talking about in the docs. But my argument would be, although this is kind of in theory, because it's not my area of expertise, which is why I'm interested from hearing from you, is that we are in a sense creating land without having to absorb the high land value costs. So therefore we should be able to justify the costs of plugging it into the wider infrastructure. Is that something that you think is going to be feasible there? And is that does my theory stand up?
I mean, I think there's a number of challenges of making things work. As we move to electrification, increasing electrification, demands on the grid are going to come more and more into focus, and there's parts of London that are already super constrained. So making that capacity is dealing with that as an engineering problem. As a concept, there's probably a wider issue around waste, and sometimes these questions are interesting around where the investment boundary is. And so I looked at a project in a similar way around sort of temporary facilities, fencing for events. We were looking at the embodied carbon of it in a previous role, in fact. And one of the things of what do people do? They buy fencing for an event and then they dispose of it. And they don't do it because they want to. They don't have storage. So if by changing the ownership model of that, you can lease fencing, actually suddenly it becomes someone else's problem and you buy it when you need it. So that might not be the answer here, but perhaps looking at the problems in a slightly different way, where there's a requirement for infrastructure that may not be used all the time, or that is temporary, there could be innovative ways to find around it. And certainly if that development is key to unlocking the potential of an area, then we need to look at different ways. We're a constrained land area. So if innovative ways in a whole life cycle way can address all of the issues without pushing it on to someone else's problem, then surely that's got to be a good thing.
Well, that's good to hear, Andy. And I'd love for this to be a sort of test bed in many ways for something that could then be applied to other cities, all of which are experiencing the same issues around increasing population, constraints of land availability, and sea level rises as well, and more increased flood risk, of all of which start you going down the route of thinking about floating development. And in terms of what may be lying ahead in the medium to long term, it would be good to sort of use the raw docs as a sort of test bed for this.
So different sectors face different challenges, residential buildings and commercial buildings in particular. And I think really the big focus on residential has been brought into focus with the sharp increases in utility costs and on overheating. And traditionally where those issues can be dealt with a bit more easily in commercial buildings is where they come into sharp focus for residential developments. Again, it depends who's paying the bills. And in some developments where we're seeing student accommodation or those type of models where they're all inclusive, then all of a sudden the developers are having to think a little bit more about it because it directly affects their bottom line. What we need to tackle both of those and what those building types have in common, in fact all building types, is about how we analyse energy use. And the growing move to a compliance-based approach under building regulations, but actually looking at operational energy in a more rigorous way, which is something that's growing, about using energy use indicators or EUIs. We really need a big uptake of that, so that it's a real challenge to us as designers to actually be accountable for what we design and have some relationship, or much stronger relationship, between how buildings are designed and how they're performed, both from an environmental perspective and what those buildings will cost to run for their owners, and in terms of emissions.
Interesting. Tell us a bit more about the energy use indicators. Is that something that is a particular system that can be introduced into any building, or is it something that's wider than just one building, or how does that work?
So energy use indicators are something that's so beautifully simple, and hopefully I'll explain it in a simple way. That's a challenge to me. But really, it gives you a figure of energy per square metre for a building. The theory being you have a figure of energy per square metres. When that building or project is complete, you multiply that figure by the area that you have, and that translates to your energy bill. And it's radically different from what we do now, because our building regulations compliance is based on notional models and theoretical targets. but doesn't actually relate to in-use operational energy. So by giving these energy use indicators, it brings a robustness to the design that can't be just designing to tick a box and meet legislation, but actually is very output focused. And what's great is to see the developments in London from the GLA around Be Seen, which has been around for a couple of years now, where developers actually have to report on the performance of their projects for 5 years after completion. So it's kind of bringing all the stuff we have together in a nice way that actually, okay, we've promised this stuff, we've made commitments under planning, we've looked at designs, but actually how does it work in practice and for a period long enough to demonstrate whether that's been a success or not.
Well, okay. Oh, well, that's you learn something every day. That's very interesting. Do you think that's also being driven by investment being more focused on ESG? So having these sort of indicators that can apply and be measured and tested can help get investment in from, institutional funds that need to be demonstrating that they are delivering on their net zero commitments? Or...
Yeah. Talking about the investment side is really interesting because actually it's where we're seeing some interesting movements. So something called CREM, which is the Carbon Risk Rating Environmental Method. It's an acronym and I've probably remembered it wrong. But it's a form of analysis of looking at portfolio of buildings and in terms of their carbon impact and whether those investments or assets will become stranded. So you look at your portfolio or your building and how those emissions will pan out with a 2050 timescale. And actually it looks at it and relates to an EUI, so it brings that really nicely together. And so investors or portfolio holders can look at their portfolio and say, okay, is this investment or portfolio going to be stranded and by when? And in which case, what do I need to do now or in the next few years to improve it to ensure that doesn't happen? So it's actually probably the first time that I can remember of something from the investment community of a benchmarking scheme or a rating scheme that's labelled ESG actually directly having an impact in a very positive way on how buildings are built or retrofitted.
So Andy, there's a question that I've put a few of our members on the spot with, and I'm particularly interested to hear your response. And it always produces intriguing results. But if you were to describe yourself as either one of these particular types of people, would you say you are more of an agitator, an activator, an ambassador, or a protector in what you do?
Wow. I'm going to give a politician's answer, I think, and say a combination of all of those. And I think the particular challenge for working in sustainability is that you have to be a combination of all of those. In some cases, because we're one of the most traditional industries in the built environment, we're really slow to innovate and change things. And so sometimes the level of agitation is really needed. Sometimes people just need that little push or that spark to activate stuff, I guess. In other situations, you absolutely need to be an ambassador. And the fourth one I've forgotten. Protector, there you go. And sometimes a protector as well, because what you are doing is protecting a lot of the times, whether we're protecting third parties or stakeholders that you're influencing designs for.
Or the planet.
Or the planet, indeed, yeah.
Brilliant, Andy. So just to sort of finish off then, what's next for you? And in terms of where things are going with Introba and sustainability as a discipline, where do you see yourself sort of being active in the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years' time? So
I think what's really exciting at the moment, and especially for us as Introba, formerly Elementa, is bringing through the work that we've done on advocacy and collaboration. And I think it's super important. And the people that we work with on a regular basis, whether that's part of LDN Collective or wider group of colleagues, is that actually the problems we're dealing with and facing are so complex and difficult that no one has all the answers. So collaboration is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we won't solve some of these problems. So an open approach to that. I see some of the new developments need a different level of involvement and participation. And I mentioned some of the schemes around disclosure. I think this is going to be the real disruptor, the real change. And hopefully we will see that happening, so that buildings have traditionally been able to survive on PR alone and shiny stories in magazines and online. But actually, as we see more disclosure, we'll have to get better at our jobs. Contractors have to get better in their jobs and actually delivering what's been promised. And bringing that bit of pragmatism, hopefully, I think having with my background of working as a consultant and as a contractor and with the public sector as a client, can hopefully bring that pragmatism to what we do and continue some of the great work we've done and great projects we've done.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. That's been a fascinating conversation, and great to hear from somebody who has, in their lifetime, been an electrician, designed their own passive house, worked for Transport for London, and now sort of working across the board, including academia and teaching, and somebody who is all four of the agitator, activator, ambassador and protector, which is equally impressive. But yeah, great to know you and be working with you, Andy, and I look forward to doing more of that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Max, and thanks for having me on.